Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very special session today, Accelerating Equity and Inclusion Through Data and Technology. This conference is being hosted by NYU Human Capital Management Program, and specifically the Master's in Science degree in Human Capital Analytics and Technology. And I will be your host for today. My name is Anna Tavis. I'm the academic director for the program, and I will be hosting our speakers for today. We work very hard at NYU to play our part and role in solving for the world's most persistent issues, and bringing academia and education and working on building the pipeline of the next generation leaders who are going to be working in a business, in the private sector, as well as in the public sector, in the government and other types of organizations, using these tools, using data in solving these issues. For today, and every year we get together at this time to celebrate and share ideas and knowledge that we have about these issues. So this time around, we chose the topic of inclusion and equity, and how important it is in all of our organizations to have the right tools and the right approach and the right methods to be working in the front lines of the solution. So we worked hard to pick our presenters today and also provide you with a wide diversity of topics ranging from race, agenda, aging, and neurodiversity. You're going to hear through the day how we can bring new solutions, new tools, and new approaches to solve for these issues. So, but first, I want to remind you, as just a matter of process here, that this conference, you will get your certification accreditation through SHRM and IREM. And in the chat, you're going to see the links to those certification sites if you need them. And I also want to invite my colleague, Alan Choi, to walk you through how we designed this conference so that you could efficiently move from one session to the next and take the full advantage of what we have to offer. Ellen, could you walk us please through the conference management? We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Anna. That was very helpful. Just very quickly, I'd love to kind of walk you through. So everyone here has registered. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to quick show you one thing that was explained in the emails, but I really just wanted to show you in person while you're here with us. So here I'm going to share my screen. This is the page that should look very familiar to everyone. This is the registration portal. Right here, there is an already registered button that you click. And with your email address and confirmation numbers, you'll be able to access not only your agenda, but every link to every session within this conference. So right here, and your email address and confirmation number have been resent to your inbox this morning. So if you do have a hard time finding it, please let us know in the chat and we'll be able to assist you. But what it would look like here is it'll give you your confirmation again. It'll show you what sessions you've signed up for. And then on the top, what's really important for you guys is the for attendees. You press a down caret, and this is where you'll get all the information that you need. Your agenda will show you everything that you've signed up for and all the links associated. And then full conference access will give you all of the links across all of the sessions, even if you did not register for them. Just wanted to show that to you guys. Thanks again for being here, and I'll hand it back to Anna.
Thank you very much, Ellen. If you have any issues, please send a quick note through the chat and our support team will help you get on and off whatever your needs are. But without further ado, I want to give this first stage to our partner and the CEO of Polinode, the leading provider of organizational network analysis software company, Andrew Pitts. Andrew is actually calling from Australia, calling into the conference from Australia. So it's late at night for Andrew, and we're very grateful that he's here tonight at his time to kick us off with the latest in what he's doing with ONA in the space of equity and inclusion. Andrew, take this away, please.
Sorry, I was just on mute for a second. So I was just saying thanks to Anna and hello to everybody. So let me just start by sharing my screen. And as Anna said, what I'm going to be presenting on is organizational network analysis and how you can use ONA in order to understand and improve inclusion. So the intersection of diversity and inclusion and relationship analytics and organizational network analysis. So before I kind of get into the diversity and inclusion side of things, I'm sure that there are many people on this Zoom call that haven't come across organizational network analysis before. So let me start off just with a bit of an introduction into what organizational network analysis is. And ONA is really about using the informal relationships between people. So understanding the informal relationships between people inside of an organization. So as opposed to the formal hierarchical relationships between people, that is the reporting relationships, ONA is really about who works with whom informally and those kind of informal relationships. And it's about visualizing and analyzing those relationships as a network. And it's really about improving the way that organizations function. So using those informal relationships that we all know exist, the way that work really gets done in order to improve the effectiveness of organizations. And there's really two types of organizational network analysis. There's active ONA and there's passive ONA. So active organizational network analysis is when you use surveys in order to collect relationship data. So that's when you ask people questions like, who do you go to for advice, or who do you work with often, or who do you view as a mentor? So it's all about relationship-based surveys. And passive organizational network analysis is where you use the digital exhaust of organizations. So think about email data, think about calendar data, that is meeting data, and also increasingly enterprise social networks like Slack, like Yammer, like Teams. It's about tapping into that digital exhaust of organizations and using that kind of naturally occurring communication data in order to reveal those informal relationships and to understand the way that work is really getting done. And so whether you are using, the digital exhaust of organizations, or whether you're asking people questions, so using their understanding of their relationships by asking them about those relationships, regardless of the source of the data, that data ends up as interactive networks that we can visualize and analyze, and that we can calculate a range of different metrics about those networks, those informal networks that exist. So those are things like different types of centrality. We can also look at the informal communities that exist inside of the organization, as well as who is a bridge or broker in that organization too. So with that as a bit of kind of high-level background around relationship analytics and organizational network analysis, what I want to do is kind of motivate this discussion for the application of organizational network analysis in the context of diversity and inclusion. And it really is about moving beyond representation. So here on the left-hand side here, I have a diagram that summarizes, quite simplistically what we mean by representation. So, the question around, are we 49% male and 51% female? So here, green represents male and orange represents female. So it's about kind of pushing beyond that question towards a question that acknowledges the important role of networks and is more about inclusion. So here we have a simple diagram representing the networks that exist in an organization. And again, here we have the green nodes representing the males in the organization, and the orange nodes or circles there representing the females in the organization. And we also have one triangular node that represents the most senior person in the organization. And you'll see here that that most senior person is a male, and he's only connected to other males. And so the kinds of questions that we're looking at in this context are, are there parts of our organization where men tend to be more connected to men, or women tend to be more connected to women, or where our, diverse talent is less connected to more senior people in the organization. And that's really, what we're talking about when we're looking at, the relationship between networks and diversity and inclusion. And so I would also just want to kind of abstract this question or this problem for a moment before we dive into some kind of really hands-on examples. And here what I have is a diagram that you'll see represents, a typical organization. And in this organization, we have an entry intake. So think of that as graduates, if you will, kind of coming into the organization at the top. And we also have kind of lateral hires coming in at different levels of the organization. And we have multiple different levels here. So we have an other level, which is, you can think of as being the most junior part of the organization, so individual contributors. And then we have a T-2 level, a T-1, and then the most senior level of the organization. So people can be promoted through those different levels of the organization. And naturally, of course, this is a flow. So as well as people entering the organization, we also have people leaving the organization too through attrition. So what are the important questions in this context, and how do they relate to networks? So the first is, are we attracting diverse talent to the top of our funnel? How do we market? Who do we market to? Do we rely too much on the networks of our existing talent? So that kind of entry question can be strongly related to networks. And the second question is, how do we ensure an equitable hiring and decision-making process? For lateral hires in particular, are they coming in at the right level and with an appropriate benefits and compensation package? So that's a question around, equity in terms of particularly lateral hires in comparison of diverse talent with non-diverse talent. And question number 3, how are we onboarding our diverse talent, particularly for lateral hires? So this is more of a networks question than it is a learning and development question, because it's about, how quickly are we integrating people into the existing network, both internally as well as externally too. And the fourth question here is around promotability. So what opportunities are we giving our diverse talent? How are we ensuring that they have advocates, champions, mentors? And that too is a network question, because it's about connection to other people, but particularly about connection to more senior people. That's about awareness and opportunities, which so often feeds into promotability and promotion decisions. And the fifth and final question is, to what degree does our diverse talent leave for different reasons? Do they leave earlier or later on average? And this attrition question, So attrition is a complex concept, right? And there's obviously multiple different factors when somebody leaves, but it's often related to personal networks too. So it's also related to that onboarding question, because generally the more somebody is embedded into a network, the less likely they are to leave an organization as well. So now it's time to turn to those kind of practical examples that I mentioned. So I kind of want to get really hands-on with a number of different examples to illustrate how we can apply organizational network analysis in the context of diversity and inclusion. So I have 7 examples to talk through here. And so the first is looking at active nominations. And you'll recall that there's those 2 types of organizational network analysis. There's the active ONA and there's the passive ONA. And typically in an active ONA, when we're asking people questions through, relationship-based surveys, the first question will be a relationship question that's designed to collect information about people's general working relationships. So for example, we'll ask a question like, please identify up to 20 people at your company who are important to your ability to accomplish your work priorities. And we analyze that data in a number of different ways, but one of the ways that we do so is by regressing the total number of nominations that people receive on a set of explanatory variables, which almost always includes seniority and tenure, but we can also add to that different diverse demographics, most often gender, but also where it's available, ethnicity as well. And typically the kind of results that we receive are like this. So we will get a constant, which is the base number of nominations that people receive, and then not surprisingly, as people have been with the organization longer, so as their tenure is higher, the number of nominations or connections they have increases. And we will often include tenure squared as well, so that kind of relationship increases but declines over time too. And then for the purposes of this discussion, the most relevant coefficient there is for our dummy variable for female. And so the interpretation here is that, relative to males and controlling for tenure and also controlling for seniority, the coefficients of which you will see below, females in this organization on average have 2.2 less nominations than males. And what can be really interesting and powerful is to look at that and say, is that different in different parts of our organization? And also, how does that change over time as well? Or how has that changed over time? The second example that I want to look at is around mentorship. So formal and informal mentorship can be really important and critical. And so again, thinking about active organizational network analysis, the question that we'll often ask is, please identify up to 5 people who provide you with career-related advice and assistance. Consider people who are formal or informal mentors or are sounding boards when you need or wish to discuss your career. You may select anyone in the organization. And here you'll see on the right-hand side here that we've analyzed this data in terms of the BIPOC population, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, versus the non-BIPOC population. And you'll see we split this into the different levels, so T being the most senior level, then T-1, then T-2, and then other. And if we look at the most junior levels, so other and T-2, you'll notice that there's a real difference between the number of mentors in the BIPOC population, so that were nominated by the T-2 and the other level, versus the non-BIPOC population. So 3 mentors at the T-2 level, and then 2.8 at the other, versus 4.3 and 4.2. And that's consistent across all the different levels of the organization, including the most senior levels, the levels that T and T-1, where there's kind of less formal and informal mentorship or connection from that T-2 and other BIPOC population into those more senior levels. The third example I want to talk about here is, really about empowering the individual with insight, right? So how do we make this actionable? And this is all about individual reports. So what we can do is firstly show the individual where they sit in the overall network, which is what you see on the left-hand side, but then also calculate a number of different metrics and show that individual, how do they compare to their peers on those metrics. And in this context, one of the most powerful metrics is the one that I've kind of highlighted here, which is the proportion of this individual's connections that are to people that are more senior than themselves, that are their peers, and that are more junior. And this, goes back to that promotability question that I was talking about in the framework in the beginning, because what we often find is that kind of more diverse talent has, relative to their peers, less connection to people that are more senior than themselves. And a first step, around that is really the awareness, and these kinds of, individual reports kind of are very helpful at providing that awareness and insight. The fourth example is around onboarding. And so, here we're really talking about using passive data, which you'll remember are things like emails and calendar invites and so on. And so this diagram here, we have on the horizontal axis tenure, and on the vertical axis, the number of these passive connections, or connections from passive organizational network analysis data that each individual has. So as somebody goes further to the right, they've been with the organization longer, and as they go higher up vertically, they're kind of more integrated into the network. And so the area of most interest in this context is this kind of bottom left area, where we have people that haven't been with the organization very long, but also don't yet have a high degree of connection or integration into the network. And the key questions that we ask here are there parts of our organization that where onboarding is an issue? And in particular, is this more true of some of our diverse talent, in terms of, are we not integrating them as effectively and as quickly into the network as our kind of non-diverse talent? The fifth example here is, quite a topical one. And the point that I want to make here is that overload is experienced differently by different groups. And this data here is some very recent data, real world data, that illustrates pre-COVID versus post-COVID work patterns. So here we have the average number of meetings per person in this group by the hour of the day. And the blue line here represents or shows this average for this group for the post-COVID period. So this is the recent period. And then what we've done is gone back 12 months prior to just before the lockdown and the shift towards remote work, and when COVID first arrived on the scene. And there we've got the gray. And so you can see that the workday has lengthened. It starts earlier and it finishes later. And just generally there are more meetings, which isn't that surprising, right? And so there's definitely, when we look at this, a greater load in some respects and in some ways. And again, why is this so relevant in the context of D&I? Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that some groups do not have as much capacity, they don't have as much slack or ability to respond to work surges as other groups do. And the analysis of work patterns data has a lot to give here. For example, questions like, are we placing a higher load on some groups than other groups? Or is there evidence that they are responding to that load differently? And are there diverse groups that are more likely to leave the organization in response to higher workloads? And this goes back to that important question around attrition as well. And the sixth example here is about homophily, right? So homophily is about the tendency of individuals that are alike to connect to other individuals that are similar to them, right? So birds of a feather flock together. And here on the left-hand side, we've got some real-world data again. And in this organization, what we've done is we've sized the nodes here, the people in the network, that is to say, by the total number of incoming connections that they have, so by a measure of centrality. And we've also colored by gender. So orange here is female and male is green. And you can see visually and distinctly that there is such a marked difference between location 1 in this organization up the top, where clearly the overwhelming majority of those individuals that have this informal influence are male, compared to location 5 down the bottom, where there is a much more equal distribution in terms of the larger nodes between the two genders. And another way of looking at this is what we call collaboration matrices. So here we have a collaboration matrix on the right, and the way that you kind of read this or understand this is that the row headings here are the froms and the column headings are the tos. So this means in terms of the nominations that come from females, 39.2% go to females and 60.8% go to males. And that compares to a relative size of 30.4% and 69.6%. That is the population split or the representation. And so if we take the ratio of 39.2 to 30.4, we get a multiple of 1.3 times. And if we take the ratio of 60.8 to 69.6, we get a multiple of 0.9 times. So the interpretation of this is that females are connecting with females 1.3 times more than what we would expect if people were connecting at random, that is without regard to gender. It's important to note here that divisions and teams often have a gender skew, and HR is a classic example of that. And sometimes they can have a race or ethnicity skew as well, but that's a little bit less common. And so it's important to also kind of analyze this, and we will analyze this within divisions and subdivisions as well, looking at that with the same collaboration matrix at kind of more granular levels too. The 7th example and the final example here, and this is really an emerging trend in organizational network analysis, is to combine active ONA data and passive ONA data. So remember, I spoke about the 2 distinct types of organizational network analysis. But often in combining those 2 different data sets, we get some really interesting insights. And one of these examples here is very, very relevant to diversity and inclusion. And here what we have on the horizontal axis is the percentile rank of passive incoming connections. So here, if we look at just, for example, email communication, and we rank everybody in terms of their centrality by email communication, that's what the horizontal axis represents. And then on the vertical axis, we've got a similar ranking, but by active nominations. So this is when we're asking people to self-report their relationships. And clearly there's an element of subjectivity in those self-reporting relationships, whereas when we look at email communication, it's much more objective by its nature, right? And there are advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. But if somebody is on the 45-degree line, that means that they're ranking kind of equally in terms of the passive versus the active. Whereas if they're below that 45-degree line, they're ranking higher on that objective measure than they are on the self-reported relationships. And so here, clearly we get a correlation, as you would expect, of 0.62. But if you look at these circled areas, you can see that there is a preponderance of females below that 45-degree line. So when we look at what the data is telling us in terms of people's electronic communication versus people's self-reported relationships, females tend to rank in this particular organization more highly in terms of that objective measure. And again, we can ask this question, is this more true in some parts of our organization than others? And how does this differ between different diverse demographics as well? And so that concludes the 7th example. And So I'd love to take any questions if anybody has any.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. A couple of questions that came up have to do with, how do in your experience, how do organizations apply and when this particular tool to get at the issues that you highlighted? What would be the business case to bring these technologies in?
Yeah, so I think where that question is really going, right, is what's the most popular use case or motivation for organizational network analysis? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm really pleased to report that at least in the United States, the diversity and inclusion use case is definitely, at the top of the list or very close to the top of the list. That's probably less true in a lot of the rest of the world. But of course, there are other kind of more commercial, more commercially driven, say, use cases as well that organizational network analysis is very relevant for, right? So really the bread and butter is things like improving collaboration, breaking down silos, right? So understanding which teams are not working together as well as they should, right? Also, identifying influencers and change agents, right? And also cultural influence. So driving cultural change too, and finding cultural influences. So I think those are a couple of the kind of, I would say, more traditional, more common use cases. But that's not to say that the types of applications that I've just walked through there are not up the top of the list for a lot of different organizations as well.
Thank you, Andrew. One of the questions that came up was about the differences, cross-industry differences, especially, and you mentioned that even functionally, you see different concentrations of gender and gender preferences. So how do you account for that when you're looking at, let's say, gender equity, et cetera?
So, I mean, often what we'll do is, we look at divisions, look at functions, look at locations as well. So, I mean, one of the things as well that, we have to acknowledge is that there are cultural differences too, right? So we'll often either try to control for those factors, right, or look at those different areas in isolation to understand it. And then I think there was a question also there on industries as well, right? And I mean, it's true that there's kind of marked differences in the way that, organizations kind of collaborate and work together in different industries, right? And I think where organizational network analysis can be kind of particularly powerful and applicable is where kind of knowledge work is kind of really central and important, right? And increasingly that's, a large number of industries and a large number of organizations.
Thank you, Andrew. And the last question will be around practical applications. What are the insights that you gained doing these analyses in companies that could be translated into a change in the approach or something that could be activated in organizations to enable better integration and better inclusion, given what you've learned?
So, I mean, if we focus on the diversity and inclusion, right, because there's a lot of kind of actionable insights that come out of organizational network analysis generally. But let me talk about in a little bit more detail what I touched on with the individual network reports, right? Which is really how am I as an individual connected to other people, right? And so that can be in terms of just my general connections, right? So there's that more senior connections, that peer connections, that more junior connections. But I think where it gets even more powerful and interesting than that is when we start to kind of dig in and look at mentorship connections, right? And then not just in terms of looking at it from the perspective of diverse talent, but also what I'd like to see more organizations do, and some are starting to do, is look at it from the perspective of, let's say, senior leadership, right? And how are they, for example, connected to people that are more junior than them, and not just generally, but also from a mentorship perspective, right? So, and you know, if we look at people who hold influence in the organization as well, so one of the things that we often do is look at cultural influences, right? We can then say, well, let's look at those people that are being mentored by these cultural influences, and how do the people that are receiving mentorship, formal or informal, by these cultural influences, how do they differ by different diverse demographics? And that can be really actionable. So it's kind of in both directions, you know, from the bottom to the top, and also from the top to the bottom as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Andrew. This was phenomenal. What a strong start to our conference. Very compelling. And just a reminder to everyone that we will be sharing the video recording. And obviously you could go to Andrew's LinkedIn. All of his bio and LinkedIn link is in the program website, so you could go there and connect with Andrew and follow up on his work in ONA. Thank you very much. And now I want to invite you to the next session. Remember that you need to go to another link. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.